I smoothed the fabric of my plain navy dress, so ordinary against the glitter of chandeliers above. Every glass was raised in celebration. My son, the groom Daniel Carter, was radiant beside his bride, Isabella Harrington. For a moment I feel proud. At the head table, the Harringtons presided like nobility, basking in the glow of their empire. My place was not with them. Not the head table. My chair waited near the kitchen doors, half in shadow. I walked to my seat where golden name cards shimmered in the light. I glanced at theirs. Charles Harrington, founder and CEO. Margaret Harrington, lady of the house. Daniel Carter, groom. Isabella Harrington, bride. And then I saw mine. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the charity invite. The words struck like ice. My breath caught. A faint laugh rippled nearby, sharp as broken glass. Did they truly see me as nothing more than a burden? After all I had lived through? After all I had built in silence? I slipped the card into my purse, my hand steady, though my heart was not. In that instant, something shifted. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 68 years old, a widow from Ohio. They thought they had named me, but they were about to learn how wrong they were. And that's the moment I stopped being their joke. Subscribe if you like this kind of story. It was an autumn afternoon in Ohio. The wind carried the smell of fallen leaves and damp earth. I had spent the morning tidying my little house, wanting everything to look its best for this important introduction. My heart quickened when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Daniel came in first, his face glowing with pride. Behind him was Isabella Harrington. She was strikingly beautiful, tall, with sleek black hair, draped in a fur-trimmed coat that seemed lifted straight from a fashion magazine. Her heels clicked against my worn wooden floor, each step a reminder of the gulf between her world and mine. I offered a warm smile and extended my hand. "Hello, Isabella. I'm so glad to finally meet you." Her fingers brushed mine lightly, barely a touch. "Yes, it's very nice to meet you, Mrs. Carter." Her voice was soft, refined, polite enough that I wanted to believe this young woman would bring happiness to my son. But then her eyes began to roam the room. The small living space, the secondhand sofa, the family photos in plastic frames. "How quaint," she said, lips curling into the faintest smile. "It's refreshing to see such simplicity, isn't it, Daniel?" Daniel chuckled, missing the undercurrent. "Mom has always kept things simple." "It's something special about her." I nodded, clinging to his words. Perhaps Isabella was just unused to such surroundings. People from wealth often struggled to hide their surprise. She drifted to my small bookshelf, picked up a worn volume, and brushed the dust away. "Old books?" "At home, my parents have a full library, thousands of rare editions, but I suppose this works here too." My hand trembled slightly as I poured the tea, but I kept my smile. Then came the moment that lodged itself in my memory. Isabella opened a narrow cabinet near the window. Inside, carefully preserved in a clear plastic cover, hung my old wedding dress. It was one of the few keepsakes I had left from the day Harold and I began our life together. Her eyes lit up, not with admiration, but with something colder. "Oh, is this your wedding dress? Fascinating that you've kept it all these years. I imagine it has sentimental value. More than actual value, of course." The room fell still. Daniel quickly changed the subject, asking about her flight. I gently pressed the fabric back into place, my hand tightening around the plastic before letting go. I told myself, my son loves her. That must mean she has goodness in her, too. Perhaps it's just the clash of different worlds. Maybe things will settle with time. But as she turned away, I caught a fleeting look in her eyes, the look of someone weighing, measuring, assigning worth based not on heart, but on possessions. I said nothing. I simply smiled, refilled the teacups, and buried the uneasy whisper rising in my chest. The sense that this was only the beginning of something far more painful. The Harrington estate shimmered like something out of a dream. Chandeliers spilled golden light across polished marble floors. A string quartet filled the air with music so delicate it felt like crystal notes drifting above the crowd. Beyond the tall glass windows stretched endless rows of vineyards, glowing silver under the moonlight. I stood at the entrance, Daniel proudly at my side, and for a moment, I almost forgot to breathe. Everything here was designed to impress, to overwhelm. And it did. Guests swept past in gowns that sparkled like constellations, men in perfectly cut tuxedos with silk pocket squares. Laughter rippled through the hall, an easy, confident sound, the kind of laughter I'd only ever heard on television. I smoothed the fabric of my navy dress, simple, carefully chosen from a department store clearance rack. I had thought it elegant, dignified. But here, under the chandeliers, it suddenly felt small. Still, I held my head high. This is Daniel's future, I reminded myself. This is the family he has chosen. If they are this powerful, this respected, perhaps it will be good for him. Yet as I moved further inside, I felt the invisible walls rising. Conversations flowed freely about vineyard acquisitions, charity galas, summer homes in Europe. When I stepped closer, the words faltered, then dissolved into polite silence. A nod, a half smile, and then they turned back to each other, as though I were a shadow slipping across their golden evening. I forced myself to keep smiling. I complimented the wine and praised the beauty of the estate. No one was unkind, not openly, but kindness wasn't necessary. All it took was the small gap in their eyes, the faint hesitation in their voices to remind me that I didn't belong. And in that glittering hall, surrounded by wealth that stretched higher than the chandeliers, I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Not shame. No, I had lived too long, worked too hard, to feel ashamed of who I was. It was loneliness. The sharp, quiet ache of standing in a crowd and realizing you were invisible. I reached for a glass of champagne, the bubbles rising like stars in liquid gold. I told myself I would endure this. For Daniel. Because if he were happy, I could bear being unseen. But deep inside, a small voice whispered what I dared not say aloud. Happiness built on exclusion cannot last. The Harrington estate was alive with light and music, but I had never felt more like a guest in someone else's story. Then Margaret Harrington arrived. She moved like a queen entering her court, emerald silk flowing behind her, diamonds scattering the chandelier's light. People shifted to make space as though the air itself bent around her. She wasn't just Isabella's mother, she was the matriarch, co-owner of the Harrington fortune, a woman who knew her power and wielded it like a polished blade. I, on the other hand, stood in my navy dress, simple, chosen with care, but without designer labels, the kind of dress that tried not to call attention to itself. My hands were steady, my smile practiced. I wasn't here to outshine anyone. I was here for my son. Come, Margaret said, slipping her arm through mine as if she were graciously lifting me into her world. You must meet some of our circle. Her voice was smooth, elegant. Mine, when I answered, was quiet, steady. Of course. Thank you. She led me to a cluster of glittering gifts near the grand staircase. This is Daniel's mother, she announced, her smile brilliant. She's from Ohio. The word Ohio dropped into the air like a stone into still water. A few polite smiles flickered, brittle and thin. How quaint, one woman murmured. I kept my smile, though my chest tightened. Isabella joined us then, dazzling in silver, her beauty undeniable. She brushed my hand with hers as if the gesture itself were charity. Mom, I was telling Evelyn how wonderfully practical she always looks. She said brightly, It's refreshing, isn't it, not to be obsessed with appearances? A polite laugh moved through the group like wind through crystal glasses. In that moment, the contrast between Margaret and me felt sharp enough to cut. She, the woman of diamonds and dominance, defines others with a single phrase. And me, the woman of quiet endurance, refusing to let her definition erase me. When a man asked me what I did, I opened my mouth to speak. But Margaret's hand pressed lightly against my arm. Her smile widened. She's very modest, she answered for me. Daniel gets his grounded nature from her. Her tone was flawless, her delivery perfect. To the room, it sounded like praise. To me, it was dismissal. I raised my champagne glass, my silence steady. She had the diamonds, the chandeliers, the crowd at her side. But I had something else, something she could not yet see. And as I watched her bask in her own performance, I felt the truth settle deep within me. Margaret Harrington believed she had placed me beneath her heel, but she had underestimated the strength of a woman who had spent a lifetime standing tall in rooms where no one wanted her to belong. The months that followed blurred into a flurry of planning. At least that's how it seemed from a distance. I was rarely invited into the process. Most of what I knew came secondhand, through Daniel's cheerful updates over the phone. Mom, they booked the cathedral today, he told me one evening, his voice full of excitement. The flowers are going to be flown in from Paris. Isabella's mother arranged everything. I forced a smile into my voice. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to share in his joy. but each new detail he shared only reminded me that none of it had passed through me. I was the mother of the groom, yet I was watching his wedding unfold, like a stranger looking through a window. One afternoon, during a family meeting at the Harrington estate, I gathered my courage. Margaret and Isabella were reviewing invitation samples, their voices crisp and decisive. I waited until the pause between them, then spoke gently. "If you'd like," I said, "I could contribute to the rehearsal dinner. It would mean a great deal to me to play some small part in this celebration." Isabella's head tilted, her lips parting in a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "That's very sweet of you, Evelyn," she said softly, "but the dinner will be at the Vineyard Club." "The costs are considerable," Margaret chuckled, setting down her glass of wine. "Yes, dear, we couldn't possibly let you strain your resources." "It wouldn't be right." The words landed like stones. Strain my resources. As though my hands, my years of labor, my very life had no value in this room. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Mom just wants to help," he murmured. Margaret's smile sharpened. "And she does, Daniel. By simply being here. That's all we could ask." I nodded, the polite smile frozen on my lips. My heart pounded, but I said only, "Of course." I understand the meeting moved on without me. Decisions about menus, decorations, music. They spoke as if I weren't even there. Later that evening, Daniel apologized over the phone. "Mom, I'm sure it was just an oversight. You know how stressed Isabella has been with all the planning. I assured him I understood. And I did. More than he realized. Because in that silence, in those dismissive smiles, I understood my role in their world. The modest figure, tolerated but never included. And yet, I said nothing. I let them believe I was content in the shadows. What they never knew, what they never bothered to ask, was that shadows can see everything. The wedding day unfolded like something out of a storybook. The California sky was flawless. White roses climbed the trellises, and violins carried notes that seemed spun from silk. When Isabella appeared in her gown, Daniel's face lit with such joy that my chest ached. For that brief moment, I forgot the cold glances, the exclusions, the quiet humiliations of the months before. He was happy, and that was all I had ever wanted. But joy has a way of dissolving quickly. The reception glittered with chandeliers and champagne, every corner humming with conversation. I searched for my place, expecting perhaps a seat among family. Instead, I found my card at a table pressed against the far wall, directly beside the swinging kitchen doors. Each time the doors burst open, heat and the smell of roasted meat rolled over me, drowning out the music. I sat quietly, surrounded by Daniel's old acquaintances and their jeweled wives. They chatted easily, their laughter skipping past me like stones across water. I smiled when they glanced my way, but their eyes slid off me as if I were made of glass. And then, the detail that froze the air around me. At every setting, a place card glowed with names in shimmering gold calligraphy: Charles Harrington, Margaret Harrington, Isabella Harrington, Daniel Carter. At mine, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, charity invite. For a moment, I didn't breathe. My hand hovered just above the card, trembling slightly before I pressed it flat against the tablecloth. The paper was smooth, the ink precise, an act of cruelty executed with elegance. The room continued around me, a burst of laughter from the head table, the soft chime of silverware against glass, a servant brushing past, the scent of wine clinging to his sleeve. The world moved, and yet I sat still, the words burning into me. A woman at my table leaned forward, her smile stretched thin with pity. Across from me, another guest lowered her eyes, though the corners of her mouth twitched. The message was clear. My presence here was not honor, but charity. I lifted the card at last, my fingers steady now. It felt heavier than paper should, as if it carried the weight of every slight, every whisper, every dismissal I had endured. And in that moment, surrounded by glitter and gold, I understood. The real ceremony was not about vows or love. It was about power. And tonight they had chosen to humiliate me in front of the world. Margaret's jeweled hand drifted to her chest as she noticed the card I held. Her voice carried just the right note of theater. "Oh dear, surely this must be a mistake." Her eyes said otherwise. They glittered with delight. I let the paper rest between my fingers, the words charity invite staring back at me. A mistake? Number. This was crafted with care. Isabella leaned in, her silver gown shimmering under the chandelier. Her smile was polished, her voice honey over glass. No mistake at all. Honesty is important in families, don't you think, Evelyn? I met her eyes. My voice was calm, almost quiet. Yes. And sometimes honesty says more about the speaker than the subject inside, I thought. You wanted to wound me, but all you've revealed is yourself. Cruelty dressed in silk is still cruelty. Margaret tilted her head, earrings catching the light. It's charming, really. To see you here, a contrast. A reminder of how far Daniel has come. Her words stung. How far he has come? As though by marrying into this family he has escaped me. As though everything I built for him was nothing more than a rung on their ladder. I steadied my breath. Daniel has always made me proud, I said softly, long before tonight. For a moment her smile faltered, then returned sharper. Isabella leaned closer, her voice low but sharp enough to pierce. We wouldn't want anyone getting ideas above their station, would we? Polite laughter rippled, brittle as breaking glass. I set the card down gently beside my plate, smoothing the linen beneath it. My smile was small, deliberate. You're right, I murmured. Family should never forget their place. Then I glanced at my son, Daniel, sitting at the head table, radiant with happiness beside his bride. His eyes flickered toward me. He had seen the card, heard the laughter. For a heartbeat, I waited for him to rise, to defend me, to remind them that I was not a joke. But he only looked away. He lifted his glass with the others, smiling at Isabella as though nothing had happened. That silence cut deeper than all their words. Inside, something in me cracked. So this is how it is. My son, the boy I raised with everything I had, would rather protect their comfort than my dignity. The ache in my chest was sharp, almost unbearable. Regret flickered. When had we grown this far apart? When had I become a guest in my own son's life? But beneath the ache, another feeling stirred. Cold, certain. If Daniel would not stand for me, I would stand for myself. I rose slowly, tucking the card into my purse. My smile never broke, but inside, a decision hardened like stone. They believed they had humiliated me tonight. They didn't realize they had given me the reason, the perfect reason, to act. And when I did, they would finally understand what it meant to underestimate Evelyn Carter. The library was silent, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled faintly of dust and wealth. I sat alone in the corner, the name card heavy in my hand. Charity invite. The ink seemed to pulse on the paper, pulling me backward in time. I remembered another room, decades ago. Not gilded chandeliers, not polished marble. A dim kitchen with peeling linoleum floors. Back then, my days began at 5 a.m. Cleaning houses in the morning, scrubbing floors until my knees burned. In the evenings, I stood behind a grocery register, scanning cans and bread until midnight. 14 hours a day, $8.75 an hour. I carried blistered hands home, dropped into bed with shoes still on, too tired to untie the laces. And through it all, there was Daniel, my boy. He'd sit at the kitchen table, coloring in his notebooks under the weak yellow light, waiting for me to come home. "Mom," he asked once, his voice small, "do you think we'll ever live in a house like the ones you clean?" I pressed his cheek, kissed the hair damp with sleep. "Maybe not, sweetheart. But we'll have something better. We'll have each other. I believed it then. With every aching bone, with every penny scraped together, I believed love was enough. But love doesn't stop time. Harold's death shattered the world we had built. 35 years of marriage, gone in a heartbeat. People whispered that I would sell everything he left behind. His shares, his company, his little empire. A widow in her 60s, they thought. What could she possibly know about business? But I surprised them. I surprised even myself. I stepped into Harold's chair, sat at his desk, stared down numbers and contracts until the letters blurred. I learned. Slowly, stubbornly, I learned. 3 years later, the company was mine. A renewable energy firm, small in size but strong in value, spreading across the Midwest like green shoots after winter. Harold had planted the seeds. I had grown them. And yet, no one in this room knew, not Isabella, not Margaret, not even Daniel. They saw only what I let them see, the widow with a simple dress, the mother who lived in a modest apartment, the woman they could call a charity invite without fear. The library light glinted off the cruel card in my hand. I thought of Daniel now, sitting at the head table, smiling at Isabella, turning his face away instead of defending me. When had we lost each other? When had the boy who once believed in just us chosen silence over me? Regret gnawed at me. Maybe I should have told him sooner. Maybe I should have let him see who I really am, what I've built. But another voice rose within me, steadier, colder. Number. He needed to love me for me, not for what I own. And if tonight he turned away, then tonight I must stand alone. The ache in my chest shifted, hardening into resolve. They thought I was powerless. They thought they could laugh at me and walk away untouched. But I held more power in a single signature than all their borrowed fortunes combined. I slipped the card into my purse as if tucking away a promise. If they wanted to call me charity, then I would show them what charity truly means. Tomorrow, their world would learn the price of underestimating Evelyn Carter. The library was hushed, the kind of silence that seemed to watch and listen. I sat at the oak desk, the cruel place card still heavy in my purse. My fingers brushed the leather cover of a legal tome on the shelf. Ironically, contracts and obligations. I took out my phone, the screen glowing in the dim light, and scrolled to a name that had been waiting for this moment. Robert Hayes. My attorney, my confidant, the man who had helped me navigate Harold's empire after his death. The line clicked, his voice warm but cautious. Mrs. Carter? It's late. Is everything all right? I let the words settle, calm and measured. Everything is fine, Robert. But I need you to execute the termination clauses we discussed. Tonight he hesitated. You mean the Harrington contracts? Yes, all of them. Silence stretched for a beat. Then his voice, lower now, wary. Evelyn, once we pull supply, their entire production line will stall. The vineyard depends on our renewable grids. Their storage facilities, their distribution, everything runs on our power contracts. You'll be triggering a force majeure dispute before sunrise. I leaned back in the leather chair, the irony not lost on me. Force majeure, unexpected disaster. The law's polite phrase for ruin. That's correct, I said. And as you know, Section 14 of their contract allows immediate withdrawal in case of reputational harm to our foundation. I'd say being labeled a charity case at my own son's wedding qualifies. Robert exhaled slowly. You're certain? I am, I replied. Send the notices by certified email tonight. And Robert, make sure the default clauses are enforced. They'll have 72 hours to secure alternative suppliers, but they won't find any. Not at this scale, not at this price. For a moment, I let myself hear the wedding music drifting faintly through the door, the laughter, the toasts, Isabella's triumphant smile. They believed they had won, but in less than 3 days, their empire would flicker and go dark. Robert's voice softened. You understand what this means, Evelyn. The Harrington name won't recover easily from this. I closed my eyes. The memory of Daniel as a boy flashing through my mind, ink-stained fingers asking if we'd ever have a house like the ones we cleaned. And now, tonight, the same boy looking away while his mother was shamed. Yes, I whispered, I understand exactly. When I ended the call, the silence of the library wrapped around me again. Only now it wasn't silence. It was the sound of power shifting. Morning light spilled across the Harrington estate, golden and deceptive. For a brief hour, the vineyards glowed as if nothing had changed. Workers moved along the rows, trucks idled near the gates, and Charles Harrington sipped his coffee in the study, telling himself today would be a day like any other. Then the phone rang. The vineyard manager's voice was tight, trembling. Sir, the grids are down. The entire energy supply cut off. We can't power the fermentation tanks. The cooling systems are dead. If we don't restore it immediately, the entire vintage will spoil. Charles froze, his cup hovering in midair. Outside, the vines shimmered in the morning sun, indifferent to the disaster creeping into their roots. He set the coffee down too hard, porcelain cracking against the saucer. Call the supplier. Fix it. Pay them whatever they want. A pause, then the fatal words. Sir, it's not about money. The contract's been terminated. Effective immediately, the line went dead. For a moment, silence pressed heavy in the study. Charles stood motionless, then lurched toward his desk, rifling through contracts, legal files, anything that could explain the sudden guillotine. Papers scattered, his hands shaking, and then the second blow. Another call. This time from the bank, a clipped, professional voice. Mr. Harrington, your outstanding loans are now in accelerated repayment. Unless $200 million is produced within 72 hours, foreclosure proceedings will begin. That includes the estate, the vineyard, and all associated assets. Charles staggered back, gripping the edge of his desk as though the oak itself could keep him from falling. His empire, 3 generations of Harrington wine, was collapsing, not in years, not in months, but in hours. Through the window, the vineyard workers had stopped moving. The hum of machines had gone silent. The heart of the business was already dead. He sank into his chair, his face pale, his hands gripping his temples. How? How could everything unravel so quickly? But somewhere, in the back of his mind, he knew, deals this precise, this targeted, were never accidents. Someone had done this deliberately, and whoever it was, had chosen their moment with perfect cruelty. Daniel's voice cracked through the phone before I even finished my morning coffee. "Mom, something's happened." "The vineyard, Isabella's family. They're saying the power's been cut. The banks are calling. They're talking about foreclosure, bankruptcy. I don't understand. This can't be real. They're the Harringtons. They're supposed to be untouchable." I held the cup steady, watching the steam curl into the air. Untouchable? My voice was calm, measured, or just very good at pretending. Silence pulsed on the line, broken only by his breathing. "Mom, please, this isn't the time for riddles." Isabella's in tears. Her father's locked in his office. They're saying the entire vintage could be lost if they don't fix it today. How does something like this even happen overnight? I let his words hang, heavy and desperate. Then I asked softly, "Tell me, Daniel, what do you really know about their wealth? Have you ever seen the books, the contracts, or only the chandeliers and the gowns?" He stammered. I know they have estates, clubs, donations. Everyone respects them. That doesn't just vanish inside me." An ache stirred. He still believes the glitter means gold. When did I lose the boy who used to see truth in plain things? When did appearances begin to blind him? "Respect," I said gently, "can be borrowed, just like money. And borrowed things run out." His tone sharpened. "You're saying they're broke? That everything I married into is a lie?" I closed my eyes, remembering him at 12 years old, asking me if we'd ever have a house like the ones I cleaned. We had so little then, yet he never doubted my word. And now, with everything he could ever want around him, he doubts even my silence. "Sometimes," I said, "what looks like wealth is nothing but very expensive debt. And sometimes, Daniel, the people you think are powerless are the ones holding all the cards." The line went quiet. I could almost hear him sitting down, the scrape of a chair against the floor. You know something," he whispered. "You're not surprised by this." "Mom, what aren't you telling me?" My fingers traced the rim of the cup. The truth pressed at my lips, but I let it rest there, unspoken. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Inside, though, I felt the tide shift. For the first time, Daniel's faith in the Harringtons was cracking, and for the first time, he was looking at me not as the charity invite, but as someone who might know the truth. Daniel burst into my apartment before noon, the wedding still written on his crumpled suit and sleepless eyes. He didn't knock, didn't pause, just stood there, his chest heaving. "Mom, what did you do?" His voice cracked between fear and accusation. "The Harringtons are in free fall. Factories shut down, banks threatening foreclosure. Isabella's a wreck. They're saying it's sabotage. Tell me it's not true." I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing the papers spread across my kitchen table. My voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut. "True? Oh, Daniel, it's very true. And it was no accident." For a second, he looked at me like I was a stranger. I almost let him keep thinking that. "You destroyed them," he whispered. I shook my head, sliding a folder toward him. Contracts, bank ledgers, ownership papers, all bearing the Williams Energy seal. "No, they destroyed themselves. I only pulled away the curtain." He stared at the papers, his hands trembling. This says you control the renewable grids. Meridian Financial, entire banks. How? You've been living in a 2-bedroom apartment, driving a 10-year-old car. You let everyone believe that I was poor, a burden, a charity invite?" My laugh was short, bitter. Let them believe it. It made their masks easier to read inside. My chest tightened. "And you, son, you believed it too. If only you had stood for me last night, I would never have needed this moment." Aloud, I said, "Steady now. When Harold died, he left me everything. Shares, contracts, a company he built from the ground up. They all expected me to sell, to fade quietly into Florida sunshine. Instead, I studied, learned the law, the markets. I became what they feared most, a woman they underestimated. Daniel's voice shook. So all this time, you could have stopped them. You could have spared them. I could have, I admitted. But why? To reward their cruelty? To let them laugh at me without consequence? I leaned forward, my eyes locking on his. Understand this, Daniel. I didn't ruin them. I revealed them. Their empire was already rotting, propped up on debt, illusions, and arrogance. All I did was pull the right thread. He sank into the chair, burying his face in his hands. God, Mom, why didn't you tell me? Why keep me in the dark? The ache pressed hard in my chest. Because I wanted you to love me for me. Because money makes people blind, and I couldn't risk losing the one person I thought still saw me clearly. You should have defended me last night, I said softly. That was all I ever wanted. Just one word in my name. Instead, you looked away, his hands dropped, his eyes wet, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I didn't know. No, you didn't, I cut in, my voice firm but not unkind. And now you do. I am Evelyn Carter, not a charity case, not a woman to be mocked. I am the widow who took Harold's empire and made it stronger, and the Harringtons will learn that their future lies in my hands. For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy as stone. Daniel sat motionless, torn between shame and awe, and inside me sorrow mingled with resolve. If my own son cannot defend me, then I will defend myself, even if it means becoming the lesson they will never forget. It was late afternoon when I heard the knock, sharp at first, then weaker, almost pleading. When I opened the door, Isabella stood there, not the radiant bride in silver, but a woman stripped bare. Her hair was loose, her eyes rimmed red, her silk dress wrinkled like tissue. Mrs. Carter? Her voice cracked. Please. I need to talk. I stepped aside. She entered hesitantly, looking small in my modest apartment. Gone was the arrogance, the polished smile. For the first time, she looked like a frightened child. She sank into a chair, her hands twisting together. I was wrong, she whispered. Everything I said about you, the way I treated you. I was cruel. I thought our money made us safe. But now it's gone, and we're drowning. Please, if there's anything you can do, help us. I studied her, the image of her at the wedding flashing in my mind, her hand sliding the nameplate across the table, her voice sharp with mockery. Charity invite, how easily she had laughed then. And yet here she was, her laughter replaced by tears. I can help, I said finally, my voice calm, but only under certain conditions. Her eyes lifted, desperate. Anything. Dangerous word, anything. But I let it stand. You will take a job, I said, with Sunshine Cleaning Service. 6 months. Scrubbing floors, polishing windows, the same work I once did. You'll learn what honest labor feels like. She blinked, stunned. Cleaning? I've never. Then you'll learn. I continued, unflinching. Every Saturday, you will volunteer at the homeless shelter your mother's charity pretended to support. Not as a guest, not as a donor, as a worker, serving meals, cleaning toilets, listening to the people you once ignored. Her lips parted, trembling. And, I added, you'll move into the building where I live? A studio apartment. No staff, no maids, no vineyard estate. Just you, your husband, and the reality of living within your means. She shook her head slowly, disbelief shading into horror. You're asking me to give up everything? No, I corrected gently. I'm asking you to gain something. Humility, empathy, the strength to stand without inherited wealth propping you up. Silence stretched between us. She stared at her hands, then at me. For a moment, I almost saw the old Isabella, the sharp, defiant woman who had laughed at me. But then her face crumbled. If I do this, you'll save my family? Her voice was raw, almost childlike. I folded my hands steady. I will make some calls. I will see that their debts are managed, their contracts restored. But only after you've begun. Only after you've shown me you understand. Her eyes brimmed. She nodded, slow and broken. I'll do it. I'll do whatever it takes inside. I felt no triumph, only the quiet certainty that sometimes the harshest lessons are the most necessary. Good, I said, softly. Then let's begin. The first morning was the vineyard, not the glittering estate where Isabella once posed for photographers, but the soil itself. Dark, damp, alive. She stood among workers in simple uniforms, her manicured hands clumsy around pruning shears. At first she winced at the mud staining her shoes, at the sun biting into her perfect skin. But as hours passed, as she learned the rhythm of trimming vines and carrying baskets, something softened. She began listening to the men and women beside her, their stories of families, of years bent under the sun. For the first time, she understood that wine was not born in crystal glasses, but in sweat and calloused hands. The next week, I sent her to the cellar. Heavy barrels lined the cool, dim hall. She helped scrub, lifted buckets, polished the steel vats, until her arms ached. I saw her once, kneeling by a spill of grape juice, scrubbing with a rag. She looked up, and in her eyes I saw shame, but also determination. She did not look away. Saturdays were for the shelter. She stood in a plain apron, hair tied back, serving soup to men who had nothing but hunger in their eyes. At first she barely managed a smile, her voice faint when she asked, "Would you like bread with that?" But week by week her posture changed. She knelt to tie a child's shoe, wiped a table with steady hands, even laughed when flour dusted her nose in the kitchen. And then there was the apartment. A small unit in Ohio, one of the modest buildings I owned. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but it was hers. Gone were the maids, the chauffeurs, the endless staff. She cooked her own meals, washed her own clothes, swept her own floor. And Daniel, my Daniel, came to visit. I watched him help her carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs, laughing when she dropped a bag of apples. For the first time, they looked like a husband and wife, not a prince and his ornament. I did not gloat. This was never about revenge. Watching Isabella change, I thought of my own younger days, kneeling on kitchen floors, stretching paychecks, finding pride in small victories. Perhaps now she was beginning to find hers. At night, in the quiet of her little apartment, Isabella wrote letters. One to me read, "I thought wealth was my shield." But it was only a mask. Thank you for tearing it away. I held the paper for a long time, my heart heavy but warm. Family, I realized, is not built by appearances or by fortune. It is built by the work we are willing to share, the burdens we are willing to carry side by side. And in those small rooms, among scrubbed barrels and shelter kitchens, Isabella was learning. Slowly, painfully, but truly. At first, Isabella fought it. Her hands blistered after only an hour in the vineyard, the shears slipping clumsily as she trimmed the vines. Mud streaked her silk-soft shoes. She muttered curses under her breath, glancing at the workers around her who moved with ease. One afternoon, as she tried to roll a heavy barrel across the cellar floor, it slipped and slammed hard against her leg. She dropped to the ground, tears of pain and frustration spilling. For a moment she looked ready to walk out, to abandon it all. But then a worker, a woman in her 50s, with lines carved deep by sun and time, bent down and offered a rough hand. "Come on, sweetheart." None of us were strong on the first day. That moment broke something in Isabella, not her pride, but the shell she had carried like armor. Weeks later, at the shelter, she ladled soup into chipped bowls. At first her voice was timid, but one Saturday, a little girl tugged her sleeve. "Miss, can I have more bread?" Isabella bent down, smiled, and slipped the girl an extra slice. When the child grinned, Isabella felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. For the first time, giving gave her joy. The highlight was small but profound. Flour dusted across her cheeks as she kneaded dough in the kitchen, laughing when another volunteer teased her clumsy hands. The sound of her own laughter surprised her. It was lighter, freer, like it belonged to someone new. At night, in the little Ohio apartment, she folded laundry still warm from the dryer. No staff, no polished closets. Just her, humming softly as she stacked shirts and jeans. She sat by the window with Daniel, the hum of distant traffic outside, sharing a pot of pasta they had cooked together. "This," Daniel said once, twirling spaghetti around his fork, "feels more real than any banquet." Isabella only nodded, but her eyes shone. One evening, Evelyn visited. I sat across from them, watching their easy chatter in the small living room. For months I had waited for this, for my son and his wife to discover each other not in luxury but in simplicity. Daniel turned to me suddenly, his voice quieter than before. Mom, I owe you an apology. I should have defended you that night. I see it now. I see everything. The words hit me harder than any insult ever had. For a moment I couldn't speak. All the nights I had questioned whether I had lost him, whether money had stolen him from me, those doubts melted under his gaze. I reached for his hand, squeezing gently. I only ever wanted you to remember who we are. Not what we wear, not what we own. Just us. And for the first time in years, sitting in that modest apartment, I felt it again. Family. Not gilded, not borrowed. Real. 6 months later, the Harrington estate was unrecognizable. The crystal chandeliers had gone dark, the gala invitations had stopped coming, but outside, among the vines, life had returned in a different form. Rows of green shimmered under the morning sun, tended not by hired crews, but by the Harringtons themselves. Charles walked the fields at dawn, boots sinking into soil he had once only admired from a balcony. His hands were stained with earth, his shirt damp with sweat. Each morning he carried a notebook, tracking growth, learning the rhythms of the vineyard like a man meeting his land for the first time. Isabella worked beside the pickers, lifting crates, clipping vines. At first her movements were awkward, but over time they grew steady, sure. She began to understand what each worker had always known, that every bottle carried the weight of 1,000 small labors. Margaret, once queen of galas, now stood at the farmer's market. A folding table, a plain cloth, bottles lined in rows. She poured samples into paper cups, smiling shyly at passers-by. For the first time, she wasn't raising money for appearances. She was earning trust, one taste at a time. They no longer sold to grand hotels or luxury clubs. Instead, they shook hands with local shopkeepers, sent crates to small family-owned restaurants. The profits were modest, but the pride was immeasurable. One evening I watched from the road as Isabella loaded boxes into a truck with Daniel at her side. The sun dipped low, painting the vineyard gold. She wiped her brow, leaned against the crates, and laughed. Light, unguarded, the kind of laugh that came from a soul no longer caged by vanity. The Harringtons had not rebuilt their empire. They had built something rarer, dignity. The sun was setting over the vineyard when Isabella approached me. She no longer wore silk or diamonds, just simple clothes, her hands calloused, her face warmed by the work of the day. She stood quietly for a moment, then spoke. I used to think wealth was the cars, the gowns, the name on the invitations. But it was hollow. Real wealth. It's in the hands that labor, in the dignity you carry, in what you give to others. I see that now. And I'm sorry for every cruel word, for that card at the wedding. Charity invite. I thought it was clever. It was only empty. Her voice faltered, but her eyes did not. For the first time, she looked at me not as someone beneath her, but as someone to learn from. I placed a hand on her shoulder. Money can buy chandeliers, estates, even silence, but it cannot buy respect. It cannot buy love. Those must be earned, day by day, in the way we live. I let my gaze travel across the vineyard, the rows of vines tended by the very family that once mocked me, Daniel laughing as he carried crates, Margaret pouring wine into simple glasses, Charles wiping sweat from his brow. 6 months ago, I said softly, they called me a charity case. Tonight we know the truth. Charity is not weakness. It is strength. The strength to rise, to give, to stand when others expect you to fall. Isabella's tears glistened in the fading light, but she nodded, her voice steady. You've taught me more than I ever wanted to learn. And everything I needed to, I smiled then, a quiet, certain smile, not of revenge, but of resolution. At 68, I had been humiliated, overlooked, dismissed as fragile. But in truth, I had never been stronger. I was not the guest in someone else's story. I was the author of my own. And as the evening air wrapped around us, I knew this was not just about the Harringtons. It was about every woman told she was too old, too poor, too small to matter. The truth was simple, and it was mine to claim. The true measure of a person is not in what they own, but in how they live. And that, no fortune, no insult, no gilded nameplate could ever take away from me. So, that's how the story ends. If this made you think, or if you've lived through something similar, share your thoughts in the comments. Our channel is a space for sharing tales of the elderly and family revenge stories from people who have weathered life's storms. Subscribe to the channel for more, because sometimes the deepest form of revenge is simply living on your own terms,